Okay. It's so wonderful to see you guys and have our Lomedet group, which has evolved and been various different things, but really just our group of people who really want to learn deep Torah, serious text, come together. And I think, one of the things I was thinking about is I know right now that learning virtually on, with the source sheet and sharing the screen and everything is we're starting to get used to that. I realized today that I was like, oh my gosh, I really miss looking at a book. I really miss looking at like a daf or something where it's, it's just really, I don't know, there's an emotional experience in looking at a page. So I was thinking about that today. I do have a sheet that we look at, but I also just wanted to throw out there, I think it might be nice if at some point we could really learn something maybe out of a Sefer in some of our Lomedet learning or even, if it's a daf that's scanned, something where we get to have that experience of something that's just not entirely technological. So throwing it out there, would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, you'll be happy to know that I actually printed it. Yes, I realize it's a waste of paper, but like you, I need to learn in the book.
Thank you, Stacey. It's not a waste of paper. It shouldn't have shameless on it, and if it does, please tell me, but it really shouldn't, because I checked. But it, recycle it. So, or cherish it forever. But it is, there's something about connecting in a physical way right now that we haven't had in person. And that might even be truly like sometime this week, just connecting with a Sefer itself, a book itself. With all of that said, I want to start out before we go into our text and acknowledge that this is like a marker of the first year of COVID that we've been in, meaning, I say first, not chas v'shalom, it continue, but I mean that we have reached the first point in our calendar year where we actually can think back what was going on in COVID last Purim. So one of the things that comes to my mind is we did a women in mitzvot learning event where we were doing paper cutting. For those who were there, it was really fun. Yeah, it was really fun. I have mine on my wall here, and I looked at it the other day and was like, oh my gosh, this is like, that was the last time it was really in a social environment, was at Purim, and that's, I think, the case for a lot of us, where we got to just hang out and have fun, which I think makes the topic of Purim and prescribed joy all the more intense right now, because it's the timing that we're in. It's the time of year when we're told that we need to be marbim b'simcha, we need to increase our joy. And last time we had that real joy was Purim for us. I know on the East Coast it was a little bit different, but that kind of joy is something that, we have to ask ourselves, how can I really have it this year? And this year is not going to be about COVID, but I think that it's an important focus to have going into this, that for us personally, joy is, I think, our joy right now is also in relationship to where we were a year ago, and Bezrat Hashem, where we will be a year from now. So what I have here at the beginning is the question of what does it mean for us to make ourselves a time of joy, and that this is something that we do, and not just, we think Sukkot is the other time where we're thinking about Simcha, Zman Simchatzenu, and there's something very active about creating the joy. It's not like, it's my birthday and my birthday comes and I'm naturally happy because I love my birthday. It's a time where you have to do something to create the joy. And so I want us to think about, as we do some text learning, how we actually do that. And the mitzvot that are associated with Purim come to mind immediately. And then looking at the Megillah itself, how you would define joy. So marbim b'simcha, the language of simcha, but there's multiple words that are used in the Megillah for joy. So I'm going to have us start out just by reading inside the Megillah. And these are, it's primarily the end. You can see the chapters here that we're focusing on. Can I ask, does anyone know the Hebrew really well and feel like they want to read it? Maybe someone who has laned before at our Shirat Chana. It's another thing that we're longing for, or someone who feels.
I can read it.
Go ahead.
I don't think I've ever lain for it. Maybe I have. I don't know. I don't mind reading it.
Go for it. Thank you. And people can follow along the English, but I think especially with the language that we're going to be talking about, it's nice to hear the Hebrew.
just zoom it up a little bit. Okay.
Yes, hold on.
Oh, no, it's okay. I have it on my,
Oh, okay, cool. Okay, go for it.
מרדכי יצא מלפני המלך בלבוש מלכות תכלת וחור ועטרת זהב גדולה ותכריך בוץ וארגמן והעיר שושן צהלה ושמחה. ליהודים הייתה אורה ושמחה וששון ויקר. ובכל מדינה ומדינה ובכל עיר ועיר מקום אשר דבר המלך ודתו מגיע שמחה וששון ליהודים. I have laid this before. משתה ויום טוב. ורבים מעמי הארץ מתייהדים כי נפל פחד היהודים עליהם. וב-12 חודש הוא חודש אדר, ב-13 יום בו, אשר הגיע דבר המלך ודתו להעשות. ביום ההוא סיברו אויבי היהודים לשלוט בהן, ונהפוך הוא, אשר ישלטו היהודים, המה בשונאיהם. על כן היהודים הפרזים, היושבים בערי הפרזות, עושים את יום 14 לחודש אדר, שמחה ומשתה ויום טוב, ומשלוח מנות איש לרעהו. ויכתוב מרדכי את הדברים האלה, וישלח ספרים אל כל היהודים אשר בכל מדינות המלך אחשוורוש, הקרובים והרחוקים. לקיים עליהם להיות עושים את יום 14 לחודש אדר, ואת יום 15 בו, בכל שנה ושנה. קיימים אשר נחו בהם היהודים מאויביהם, והחודש אשר נהפך להם מיגון לשמחה ומעבר ליום טוב, לעשות אותם ימי משתה ושמחה, ומשלוח מנות איש לרעהו ומתנות לאביונים. וקיבל היהודים את אשר החלו לעשות, ואת אשר כתב מרדכי עליהם. כי המן בן המדעתה האגגי, צורר כל היהודים, חשב על היהודים לאבדם, והפיל פור הוא הגורל להומם ולאבדם. ובבואה לפני המלך, אמר עם הספר, ישוב מחשבתו הרעה, אשר חשב על היהודים על ראשו, ותלו אותו ואת בניו על העץ. על כן קראו לימים האלה פורים, על שם הפור, על כן על כל דברי האיגרת הזאת. ומה ראו על ככה ומה הגיע עליהם. קימו וקיבלו היהודים עליהם ועל זרם, ועל כל הנלווים עליהם. ולא יעבור להיות עושים את שני הימים האלה ככתבם וכזמנם בכל שנה ושנה. וימים האלה נזכרים ונעשים בכל דור ודור, משפחה ומשפחה, מדינה ומדינה ועיר ועיר. בימי הפורים האלה לא יעברו מתוך היהודים וזכרם לא יסוף מזרעם.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Julie. It was really nice to hear you read that. And, you know, you obviously weren't laning, but just having that opportunity, I don't know. I feel it. I don't know if anyone else does, getting to hear a woman from B'nai David do the Megillah. So just looking at this text, what is joy? And I'm using the English word because there's a lot of synonyms for it here. But what is joy in this context, and what does it mean for us to create joy? Feel free to just jump in.
Well, the joy is a combination of relief and celebration from a very specific event. And, you know, over and over again, it's this was supposed to happen and it didn't. And so there was joy. And it wasn't manufactured joy. It was spontaneous. It was like a natural reaction to the events that preceded it.
Beautiful. So Rena's like, it's so spot on. And it's also, I think, not how we naturally think about joy, that it's in relation to specific events that happened in history where because something terrible didn't happen, we had joy. And it's in reaction to that. So it's tapping back into something in the past. Michal, you're nodding along.
Yeah, I agree. It's the Jewish tradition of they tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat. But it's harder. There's a lot of when you're talking about something that's happened a long time ago, and like you were talking about that prescribed. How do you recreate that joy when you're far removed from that threat or living through a different threat?
I haven't experienced it myself yet, but I keep flashing when you brought that up. I keep flashing to people on the news being so surprised that they spontaneously started crying from relief when they got their first injection of the coronavirus vaccine, that they were relieved that they had somehow survived and not gotten the virus. And here they were finally getting the vaccine and they didn't even know they would have that spontaneous, joyful reaction to it, that they were overwhelmed by the fact that it was just very spontaneous tears. It was kind of what you were just saying, was the relief of something horrible not having happened.
That's so interesting that there's a joy in like an exhale, a feeling of relief, and there's joy in recognizing that things could have been worse. And I love, Michali was pointing out that it's hard to tap into when it's a long time ago or when you're living through something currently, which I think we can relate to. The joy, I mean, it's fascinating, we use the language like Hudim Haita Orvisim Chavasasa Vikar. We're so familiar with those words because of Havdalah. But the fact that there's so many different ways for describing what that is. I'm wondering why you think that the language is, I mean, in some ways they each mean a different thing, but it sounds somewhat repetitive. And also at the end, there's this like really intense repetition of, this is something we do always, every generation, door by door. It's that we're really hammering it home. And honestly, this text, like it could have been cut down more, but I think seeing how much this is emphasized is really important.
There's that don't forget for all times kind of feeling, like have very much for how long our history is and how many different times we had very close shaves in history. There aren't that many where we're like, this is every year forever. Don't forget this. And the thing that came to mind for me was that we have earlier in the Megillah, they make it a point that we were very concentrated at the time in 127 different districts or something, but they were all within where Haman would have had this edict. Like we were more concentrated, so we had more of a chance of being completely wiped out than even, and chas v'shalom, the Holocaust. I mean, by the 20th century, we were all over the globe, and mostly Eastern Europe was hard hit. But if you were a Jew in America or Australia or whatever, this was back in the time when we were so concentrated, really, truly, it was maybe our closest shave.
To think that many Jews could have been destroyed in so many different places, and we were somehow able to all have unity. I mean, that's one of the things that gets emphasized so often at Purim is our achdut. We need to come together in joy, and there's actually like some fascinating learning projects that are happening with, I saw something coming out of the OU. There's a variety of things where like, let's all learn together in honor of Purim, which makes sense for any holiday, but there's something about Purim that always comes back to this achdut. The language of Osim et Yom Arba'a Asar Chodesh Adar Simcha U'Mishta V'Yom Tov, that we make it, it's Osim, we're doing something to make it a day of happiness, of feasting, of Yom Tov. I mean, we're not the ones who create Yom Tov, that's God. So why is this something that we're doing? Why do you think does it need to be active? Does that say anything to you about what joy is in your own life?
I think because we're mimicking a joy of the past. It's not, that it has to almost be prescribed. Like you have to know how to do it, because you can't just spontaneously ignite joy. So you do things that will bring you joy.
One of the things that I caught kind of two interesting things here. One is originally I had kind of thought, Simcha Mishta V'Yom Tov and Mishlach Manot Ish L'Rehu go together, that like part of the joy is in sharing with others. It's I think how I always thought about Purim, but in reading it a little bit closer, they're kind of two separate things. It's Simcha Mishta V'Yom Tov u'Mishlach Manot Ish L'Rehu, that there's this joy, and then there's also this practice which could be about bringing joy, but it could also be about recognizing that like other people might not have what you're having. So in finding like empathy in your own joy and making space in it, which is, I think, different than how I ordinarily thought of it, especially later when it reiterates in the same way, that like those are two categories. Like you have your party, but also externally, don't forget about the non-partying people or find a way to help that party. And then similarly, I think I always thought, Rav Simcha v'Zason v'Ikar were all feelings that were had simultaneously by all people. But I'm wondering if it's actually for the Jews, some had light and some had gladness and some had joy and some felt, this like honor of
Oh, interesting.
and everyone experiences it a little bit differently, that there wasn't one way to experience the event. Different people had it in different ways, and all of these manifestations of joy are acceptable.
That's interesting because I read it as an opportunity for communal connection and a shared experience, because the pasuk of Vayehudim Hayta Rav Simcha v'Zason v'Ikar has a parallel earlier in the Megillah where all the Jews have, Avel and Sakva Efer and all of that. And so they have equally appropriate responses as a group to the events that happen to them. And so but I think that you still raise an important point about how that then gets translated to later celebrations, because we do lose that unity if you have your party and then you also give food to other people and then you also help poor people separately.
Who were these other people though? Because the next line after the Jews had all this is everyone else is scared.
Right.
So if they're giving portions to people, is that others amongst Bnei Israel already still, or are they, what's going on with that? Because it's striking how.
Oh, you mean
right after
the Matanot Le'Avyonim you're talking about, or the Mishloach Manot?
1 second. In verse 17, which has
the whole Medina, the whole.
Yeah. So then if we're then going back to they're giving gifts and all, so that's amongst, if everyone's already happy already, are they giving gifts just to celebrate their mutual happiness? Or is there something else is that's going on that relates to the fact that everyone else is becoming very afraid of their own situation?
That's very, I mean, it's sort of also, if you think of how we can be like an insular community experiencing something and it'd be totally disconnected from the rest of the world around us, and how there is something about, I mean, it's certainly the way that we, B'nai David, experience Purim, that it's, we're giving within our community, but we also extend it beyond, which isn't necessarily essential in what, as you're pointing out.
I agree though that Purim is one of those holidays. I mean, I feel like my individual family is fine keeping Shabbat, lighting the menorahs on our own, having our own Pesach Seder. I really feel it with Purim. The things that we're supposed to do are so community oriented. They're very specific mitzvot, and they're very specifically, like for me, the joy at BDJ, when I think about Purim, it starts when we make that assembly line and we're all packing the shalach manas together. That was joyful. The delivery of it requires a community to do that with. The seudah is kind of only a party if everybody's kind of sharing the joy, and the Megillah reading only feels joyful because the whole room is there screaming Haman and stuff. So it's like, to me, this really is kind of the most community oriented. You have to have the poor in a community to even do Matanot Le'Avyonim. So I feel like these are specifically, even as a family, we can just build our own little sukkah and we kept Sukkot, but I need community for
Right,
poor.
we need more.
Them are definitely a bigger thing.
So Matanot Le'Avyonim, like the halacha of the mitzvah is that it's supposed to be for, you give, at least to two people in order for them to celebrate Purim, which is why it has to happen on Purim. So it's, it's not even, it's external, but it's also extremely internal. And I think that the community element that you're describing here comes across and how this is something we're all supposed to be doing for generations, and thinking about, what Cindy and Rena were saying, there's like a personal experience, but it's always somehow tied back to this communal experience. I'm wondering, and I'm going to have us look at some text commenting on this, but I'm wondering the Navajo language of things being flipped, and what Rena was alluding to, that there's the language, pull it up so it's in front of you. Just that we're going from sadness into joy, and mourning into celebration, going from one thing to another. Do you think this is like a Jewish kind of joy? Because I think of Pesach as well. Is going from one thing to another as the definition of joy, of the lahefech. Is that something that you think is uniquely Jewish? Is it just really at the core of humanity and how we experience joy is we have to have something that comes first that's a problem?
I think, I'm not sure if it's uniquely Jewish, but it feels like, even going back, like, we wouldn't know it was light if we didn't know it was dark. We wouldn't really know what joy is if we didn't really appreciate, suffering. If everything was Gan Eden, right, that would just be the norm. It feels like so many of our stories are, there was darkness and then there was light. Yeah, there was this, right, and then there was that. Like, I'm not sure as people that we can appreciate something. It's like when you're sick and then you get healthy, you have like a brand new appreciation, like for being healthy. So, I had COVID and I was tired and exhausted and I had a headache, and all of a sudden, I didn't have a headache. I wasn't so tired. And I just really took for granted what it was like to not have a headache, and be tired in this sort of interesting way. Like, I think maybe it's human nature. I don't know that it's uniquely Jewish, but I think it's part of our value system.
Great.
Building on that for just a minute, I think that Vicky's right. It's probably human nature, and it's probably universal that we clearly can appreciate the light once we've experienced the dark. And so it's easy to have joy once you've had something to counteract that. What I've been noticing recently or over the course of the year is how it is that we have this overwhelming feeling of joy in something that wasn't dark, just an actual mundane everyday activity that happened all the time before COVID happened. A teacher hugged a student goodbye at the end of the day. No one thought that was joyful, but witnessing that now, that was just a random everyday occurrence. It wasn't something horrible that happened. It wasn't tremendous darkness. And there, at least for me, I'm finding that there's like this weird sense of joy in noticing very, very small things that aren't big, monumental, life events.
Totally. And I think that experience can also make this Purim even more special, because for us, what it means to be besimcha it's transformed this year. And there is definitely, we can say like, well, we don't get to have a community in certain ways, but there is a different appreciation as you're describing. And I think, I put in here, like, why is this happening at this point in our calendar? I think that there's intentionality from Hashem, from Chazal, in obviously the calendar is what it is, that there are certain days when all of this happened. But the fact that it's the days leading up to Pesach for us in that calendar that has a circular effect, the fact that it's traditionally also somewhat in winter but going into spring, there is I think and then even each year in our own lives there's a chance to ask, like, why am I supposed to be happy right now? This is part of a bigger story and it's fixed, and yet at the same time my experience of it is going to be different every year. So I just want to throw that out there to think, in reflection at some point. why you think Purim falls when it does in the calendar, and that's something we can also weave in later on as we continue in the texts. So I'm going to jump to this. I put Masechet Tani in here because I think, you know, we all know it. It's almost like you can't learn about Purim without referencing Misha Nichnas Adar Marbi B'Simcha. You know the song. When this time comes, this is really the like explanation of how we have to increase our joy. We have to have joy. It has to be big. It has to get bigger than whatever it was, you know, before Adar, which is, you know, we have Rosh Chodesh coming up at the end of this week, Friday and Saturday. So that is the chiyuv we have to increase joy. The Gemara in Masechet Megillah gives us interpretations of what all of these words that we mentioned at the beginning that we're familiar with from Havdalah, what they mean, what joy actually is referring to here. So we've been talking about it as, you know, maybe it's the sort of simcha that Stacy was talking about. Maybe it's like simple joys in life. Maybe it's joy that comes with being in community. Maybe it's from going from darkness to light, or from giving something to someone else. There's very specific interpretation of these words in the Gemara. So someone else want to read in the Hebrew first? So it's Layudim Haitza or the Simcha V'Sason Vikar. That's the pasuk. So Rav Yehuda said that Orah here is referring, that's Zu Torah, that's referring to Torah. So we know from a variety of different sources, but the one quoted from here is Mishlei, Ner Mitzvah, so referring to Torah as Or. And so Torah is light. So anytime you see the word light, you think Torah. Anytime you see, you know, Torah, there's this relationship with light. So they're somehow synonymous. So when you see that language of Orah, it's referring to Torah. So when we say that the Jews had Orah, it means that they had Torah. So the rest of this follows that same structure, where we have this Simcha is referring to Yom Tov, because we see that we're supposed to have Simcha around the Chagim with holidays. So same thing, they're associated. So far we have Orah refers to Torah, Simcha refers to to Yom Tov, which, you know, comes along with feasting and all the other wonderful things that happen with our Yom Tovim. Sason is referring to Mila, because there's a reference of Sas, of having this joy that's related in the context of Mila. It's in Tehillim. In Tehillim. And the last one is that Vikar, which is that sort of honor, is referring to Tefillin. The explanation is because there's a pasuk in Devarim that both uses the looking at something, which is the same thing where we look at Tefillin and it's supposed to, through our vision of it, it's supposed to make us remember Egypt and all of the mitzvot themselves. Also play on the word of Mikra, of Vikar, that's sort of an honoring experience with God. So far it's Orah is Torah, Simcha is Yom Tov, Sason is referring to Mila, and Vikar is referring to Tefillin. So basically, really important mitzvot. Some of the like top mitzvot to remind us throughout our lives that we are connected to God, and that our lives, our calendar, everything we do, our bodies, everything is run by God. What are your thoughts on this being the, you know, sort of like rabbinic interpretation of joy? Probably makes sense, but go ahead, Cindy.
This is like maybe not the direction we want to go in, but like this is really male, especially around a holiday that is like decisively female. So like you could read it as like these are really monumental mitzvot. It's a very beautiful read, but it's like, okay, Torah for everyone, sure. Yantif, well, v'samachta b'chagecha, women like have various obligations around it. So like, cool. And then you have Mila, which is not incumbent on a woman, and Tefillin, which is like arguably not incumbent on a woman. And this is joy. So I'm choosing the patriarchal read. I don't need to derail everything, but that's where I am right now.
This is not derailing at all. It happens all the time in our tradition, but when we see it here, you know, like, how am I supposed to have full joy right now in this experience when I can't do half of them? Or my practice isn't connected really to half of them.
Especially like when you're pulling from the Megillah, which is like a really important female heroine moment to be like, but actually this is what joy is. We're still here. Like, I don't know. There's something about it that like, yes, these are important mitzvot, but there is I don't know, frozen a certain way.
It also imposes a different kind of narrative on the Megillah, because, the threat in the Megillah was a very specific physical threat, right? Haman didn't care that if people learned Torah or did Milah or followed, or celebrated the holidays. Haman just wanted to kill people and take their money. And so to impose this, they overcame a kind of religious persecution that we've seen in other times. And maybe that's what Rabbi Huda is actually alluding to, that even if we're not in a time of physical persecution, if those kind of mitzvot are under attack or being prevented, if we're being prevented from doing those mitzvot, then it's a similar kind of threat that we need to respond in kind and try to overcome that threat and to be as happy if that kind of threat doesn't come through. But I 100% agree with Cindy's read that this is too male to have anybody in this side of the mechitza relate to it.
Great. Lilia, were you going to say something too? Okay. No, I mean, I'm with you, and it's a Rena did a beautiful job of interpreting it too, as this is a maybe a bigger reflection on what it is to appreciate when we've been persecuted and we don't have access to these mitzvot. But it is, just in sort of stepping back and defining joy and what does it mean to be b'simcha on this holiday and always. The fact that half of them are related to mitzvot that women traditionally don't practice is, for sure, either othering or has to be asked, especially when we're learning together as women, because, what do we do with this? So I think part of it is, the fact that the tradition is often very male voiced. But I also think that these mitzvot, at least with Milah and with tefillin, they're very, very physical. So having, Torah and holidays, those are like experiential learning, in our minds, but there's something about Milah and tefillin that it is by nature, both of them are very, very physical. So I don't know if it could potentially highlight that happiness has some sort of a physical component to it. I'm not sure. I don't know if anyone has any better answers, because it's a really good question.
I was seeing those as teaching the next generation. Because for Milah, it's this joy of a new child that you're bringing into, and at the time that this was written, they don't have the extraordinary simchat bat or whatever that we currently do. Not to take away from that idea, because I agree 100% with that. But I was seeing it as that. I was seeing it as like Torah and Yom Tov are kind of all encompassing, and then the idea of passing the joy onward is, Milah bringing a child in, and tefillin of like bar mitzvah of like someone coming to the age where they can fulfill the mitzvah.
What's missing there is chuppah.
I was just going to say, I associate the phrase with weddings, and weddings are all about the bride.
But that's interesting. Chuppah and masim, so
yeah, Torah, chuppah, masim.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, thank you for pointing that out. This is one of the fantastic things about B'nai David and about our community, and also sort of the Orthodox feminist world of we bring a different voice and reading to traditional texts that otherwise wouldn't be seen that way, but we also, I think, are challenged to find a way to create meaning because we're in this, and no matter what mitzvah it is, we're challenged to figure out, how am I going to connect this? How am I going to connect to this text? How, what do I do with this? And some are better than others. Some are much less satisfying. But thank you for raising that. So going in the direction, thinking again about what it means to be b'simcha, the Ohev Yisrael, who was Abraham Yoshua Heschel, not Abraham Joshua Heschel, but Abraham Yoshua Heschel, who was a Hasidic rabbi, like really big founding rabbi in 1700s, 1800s. He was known for his love of Israel, which is like interesting that it's connected to Purim, because Purim is also so much about loving each other. And he was known for emphasizing very strongly that Ikar HaSimcha, the ultimate essence of joy, is going to be something that comes from the movement of one thing to another, of the v'na'afochu, of the flipping, exactly as Julie emphasized at the very beginning. Rena said as well, going from sadness into happiness. That is what Simcha is all about, which I think is very much so clearly what we see in our Purim practice, from the fact that it's, the one time that there's cross-dressing that's permitted, and anything where you can take one thing that's normally one way and turn it the other way, that brings joy. And it's multiple different halachic writers talk about, like, it's humor, that what comes out of it is humor, to laugh at something because it's shocking when it's the opposite, which is part of the dressing up process. But also you see the next text from the Shulchan Aruch, that the Adar Yaza point that we're, again, very familiar with, of getting drunk to the point where you can't tell the difference between things, that seems to also be joyful, which, on the one hand, like, I totally see that when things are sort of topsy-turvy or something doesn't make sense, I think of my daughter Ella, like, that's really funny because that doesn't make sense. Like, let's laugh, when things aren't as they seem. And at the same time, I think sometimes when things aren't as they seem, they're the opposite of what you'd expect. Sometimes that can be scary. Sometimes people who, like control or like to be able to expect things to happen a certain way, maybe not for everyone that brings out some sort of joy. But there seems to be a real understanding that the way we experience and not just perceive joy, but implement joy, like, how do I practice joy? It's by turning things the opposite. Like, you'd never think that saying Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai, that those are, that flipping those would somehow make me happy. So I'm curious, just looking at that, does that concept of joy as being, turning things upside down, is that something that you like, that you connect with? And I know that we've talked about it in our context where it's taking something bad and turning it into something good, but this is also taking it, in our actual experience, it's not always, taking sadness and turning it into joy.
I think if you're talking about trying to create joy where there isn't natural joy because you're celebrating a holiday, you're not experiencing the joy. I think actually looking at it as humor is actually a really powerful way of thinking about all these crazy things we do on Purim. I'd never thought of it that way before, but humor is defined as something unexpected, right? You laugh when somebody, gets Coke out of their nose, because that is not something you would expect to see at in the middle of a meeting or whatever it is. So I think that's actually and then you get happy because you're laughing, right? The laughter itself, the humor itself brings joy. So I think it's actually a really interesting way to think about the weird things we do on Purim. I'd never thought of that.
You're also making me think of, like, at weddings of, you're supposed to make the Chatan and Kala happy. And that's also like silly dancing and well, there's other ways that we sort of ritualize or think about this Nafilhu language. And that is one of the ones, one of the things that we do, and I bolded the part, really, like, most of the part that's translated, but I gave you the whole thing because if you're interested in it, it happens to be the place where we see the Arpa Parshiot, the 4 Parshiot in the Mishnah Berurah, where we see what Chazal did with them and the reason behind each one. But we're just going to focus on the one from Purim. So the requirement in relationship to Purim to start out not just with the Megillah itself having this narrative of going from sadness into joy and having things flipped upside down, it actually really starts earlier, because we have this requirement of Parshat Zachor, which, side note, if you have not yet read the halacha how-to for that this year, it's a very important one to read because women also have a chiyuv in Zachor. We put it in the Purim email. It should go out again, but I'm just going to say, since we're together, we might as well. So this year is a very, very weird year with Zachor. If you have been going in person to Minyanim to hear Zachor, then you should just absolutely go to hear your Doraita Chiyuv, your obligation to hear Zachor, which is the text of Amalek. And that will happen in person at Minyanim for B'nai David. If you are not able to go in person, there are some alternatives. One is if you happen to own a Sefer Torah, you can read from the Sefer Torah, and that would fulfill it. You just wouldn't do the brachot before and after. And if you don't have a Sefer Torah, then you are able to read from a Chumash, just reading the text itself. And then later on in the summer, when we actually will hear, I think it's in Kitetse, the language that comes up, that those verses get read again, make God willing, you'll be able to go in person and hear Zachor then, and then you'll fulfill it, because the chiyuv of Zachor is really recalling Amalek and the need to blot out Amalek by remembering Amalek, which is like a whole conversation on its own. That it has to happen at least once a year, and the idea is that in Avelut, when someone is in mourning, 12 months is what comprises the time where one can move, really where one can forget or not fully be in a place of where they were a year ago. That's like the marker for us halachically of time. So the same thing with experiencing remembering Amalek. We're afraid that if someone doesn't do it at least once a year, that they'll forget. So that's how we're handling it this year. And there's more detail in the email that went out. But just looking at this text from the Mishnah Berurah, we have these parshiot that are fixed that we're doing, that need to be read at this time of year. We do Shkalim, which is this Shabbat, Zachor, which will be next Shabbat, and then Para and HaChodesh, which happen after. Zachor is said, it's said remembering what Amalek did leading up to Shabbat before Purim, and it's supposed to make it so that we remember, just as I said a few moments ago, that we're supposed to blot everything out, blot Amalek out, and we have to remember and be a part of that. So the process of doing this work of flipping something from bad to good, and also from beginning to have sort of inspire the joyful, humorous reaction to things, starts really next weekend, because we recognize, things could have really gone bad and they didn't. And that's, as Michali said beautifully, that so we eat. But that is something that starts even before Purim. So we ritualize that and internalize it in different ways. And I think it's getting us ready. There's I think a really interesting text. This is, the Hebrew is wrong here. It should say Masachet Chulim. I'll fix that later. But the Gemara Masachet Chulim, in the context of discussion about Shiluach HaKain, returning the bird, the mother bird, the sending away the mother bird. There's a discussion of what kinds of nests halachically fit into that category. I don't know if you've learned that before, but it's like very interesting. What if the nest is actually being carried by the mother bird flying in the air? Do you still have the chiyuv to do shiluch, like things like that? So it's fascinating. Out of nowhere, we get this text, and it's because the person who's quoting it happens to have been recently speaking, which happens all the time in Gemara. But this text comes out of nowhere in that context. So let me ask someone, read it. You're welcome to read in the Hebrew or the English. Michali, please go for it.
From the Haman.
Yes.
Okay. Haman min haTorah, minyan Haman ha'et. Esther min haTorah, minyan minayin. Sorry.
Minayin.
Yeah, minayin. Haman ha'et. Esther min haTorah, minayin vanochi. Esther estir Mordechai min haTorah, minayin dichtiv. Mar dror umitra geminan. Mira Dichya, and then Rashi says, Lemase Esther, Esther Estir Bime Esther, Yehia Esther Panim, Umetzeuhu, Sarot Rabot Vero.
So similar, like where we've seen other structures of, what about this? It happens all the time in the Gemara of Minayin. So how do we know that this is referenced in the Torah, or where can you find this concept in the Torah? Already like an intellectual exercise of, you don't need to find it in the Torah, but let's like try to find it. Where could it be? And so the idea is that there's a reference to Haman where it says Hamin, using the exact same letters, just vocalized differently, in Bereshit. And this is in the moment where God has found us in Sedayeka, and we're wondering where we are, and we're naked and we're hiding, and God says, did you eat from the tree? And it's Hamin ha'etz is how that sentence starts. So did you eat from that tree that I told you not to eat from? That Hey Mem Nun Sophie happens to be used there. So Haman was referenced in the Torah. Really interesting that it's at that moment where we have this fall and sin and really like we're starting with the dark. So if you think of going from internalizing somehow, going from something bad, going something good, and trying to make that a spiritual experience, I think the text is very clearly doing that here, because we're starting with Haman. Yeah, what?
The beginning of evil.
Right, exactly, the beginning of evil, and perfect. Way better said. So that's the first question. Then we're like, okay, so what about Esther? Where does Esther come up in the Torah? And that's in the context where we are, we're told if we end up sinning and turning away from God, then there's going to be this Hester Penny, and there's going to be this, real hiddenness of God's face from us. And then the last one is, where is there going to be a reference of Mordechai? It's in the context of the anointing oils that have to be made for the service in the Mishkan and in the temple. And these have the Mor Zaror, this combination of spices that have to be used. And it's actually, karetz is the punishment for messing that up or trying to replicate it when we shouldn't. So it's very, very serious law. And the way Matargamina, and the way that it gets sort of translated is the language looks like, you can see it here, it looks like Mordechai, sort of. So that's another answer. The Rashi here is just commenting that there's an understanding that when God's going to hide his face, it'll be by creating a lot of really intense suffering for us. So I think it's an interesting text to look at as a flow from the beginning of evil, as Deb said beautifully. Then sort of the suffering that we experience in this world from sin, and then the chance to come through it in the form of the Mishkan and the temple as a way of uplifting us. So you sort of see like the language of Haman, Esther, and then Mordechai as the movement of what spiritually can happen for us. You could also give comments on Mordechai being male and Esther not having that same thing if you wanted to. So I think that whether it's through Zachor or if it's through sort of the narrative that the Gemara weaves about, where you see Haman, Esther, and Mordechai, there is this ongoing vision of what we've been talking about, that we nafochu is really the experience of being besimcha, but it's not just how we tell the Purim story. We internalize it the weeks before Purim. It's how we do this. There's a really beautiful text from Yerushalmi that I think communicates everything that we've been saying, but does so within the Purim context in a very nice way. So can I ask someone else to read for us? Again, it can be in the Hebrew or the English. Please go for it, Vicky.
And there was light. Rabbi Chia, Rabbah, and Rabbi Shimon bar Chalafta were walking on the road, and they first saw light when the light emerges. Rabbi Chia said to Rabbi Shimon, this is the greatness of Yisrael. Little by little, it gets greater and greater. How so? As it is written, though I sit in darkness, God is a light to me, Micha. So too at the beginning, Mordechai sat at the gate of the king, and Mordechai went out before the king dressed royally, and there was light and joy, gladness and honor for the Jews.
Awesome. So what are your reactions to this? Do you like the imagery of the sun rising and things getting brighter and brighter. I mean, here it's the focus is around Mordechai too, but you see it going from like things were bad, then they were better, and then they were amazing. So there's this flow that's happening too. And it's sort of like even built into the fabric of nature and what it is to be Israel goes back to Purim. The Purim experience is the one that sort of exemplifies the sun coming up every single day.
The imagery of the little things that like what Mordecai did in reporting what he heard Big Son and Teresh talking about was like actually, it was important, but it was a little thing. Like it wasn't a big deal for him to overhear it, and it wasn't a big deal for him to do the right thing. And because in that moment, no one would have ever known he overheard it, and he could have just walked away. And how many times does that happen to us? But he chose to do this small thing and say, like, let people know. And what that led to was more and more, advancement of, him being dressed as royalty. And ultimately that led to the Jews. And I like that idea of just like the greatness can come from a small action, and that like joy, we plant the seeds of joy like early on. And I think in terms of Purim specifically, like as a holiday, we don't really see God at all in the Megillah, but we in the story of Purim, we know that there was a plan. Like God planned for this whole thing to happen in the way that it did. And so I think it's kind of like we can mirror that with our own Salam Aleichem. Like we can plant our own seeds of joy. We can do small little things, kind of like what Stacy was saying. Like there are these simple moments of joy, but eventually they build on each other. And we have the opportunity to create bigger and bigger ones. I think like that's what I'm getting from it.
Beautiful. I mean, it really takes us back to, thinking of how this is something that's prescribed and we're told that we need to do, but it's going back to the Megillah. It's something that really starts with us choosing to take it on and do it. So how do we do it? And I think as Cindy, what you were just saying is very instructive for all of us and how we can do that, especially this year. Other reactions? People agree with Cindy, disagree?
Yeah, it's like seeing hope in a glimmer of light, that just a small bit of something good can be leading towards the great joy, that like not to let those little moments of hope pass you by, that they saw the light in the morning and then it reminded them of like, look, how things started out for Mordechai and then they grew.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a cool thing to think like they were just walking and saw the light in the day and they were like, oh yeah, that's like, the Torah. It's a great way of looking at life.
Yeah, I never would have.
Vicky, sorry, you're about to say something.
I know, I was just going to say, I also like the action piece of it, and I love the whole garden analogy, because to me, it's also like, it's a process, which really does sort of, it's everything that we've been saying before night too, that it's not just, okay, here it is. It's like a process. So like you plant the little seed and then you water it. You can't just plant the seed. I mean, I've been growing tomatoes. So you can't just plant it and leave it alone. You have to go out there and tend to it and nurture it and pay attention to it. And then, and it's joyful. Like you watch these little things grow, but you also have to do something, so you have to plant the seed and the water and check it. And, like it takes action and it takes time. And I also like that whole idea of like, it's prescribed for us. It's like you do this and you do this and you do this, and you have like lots of little,
like a prescription.
Yeah. It takes time and it takes care and attention and nurturing,
Interesting too that Tu B'Shvat comes before it too. Sorry, go ahead, Stacy.
I was gonna say it's resonating with me that it's very very ringing true to child rearing. Like these grown adults, these adult children didn't become adult children overnight. And it took a tremendous amount of action and participation and effort
and care and attention
and care and attention, just like the tomatoes. And the truth is, I'm feeling we had a very dear friend's child get married last night, and we were not physically at the wedding. And there's been a lot of lead up to this wedding and the fact that so many of their dear friends wouldn't be there because of COVID. And it's just resonating with me because I've been thinking a lot about how my kid's age is getting married, that like they didn't get there on their own, right? They didn't get to this point to be standing under the chuppah by themselves. It took a lot of this care and attention along the way. And when you're looking at this metaphorical light sun coming up, it really is shining on, the young adults that they're becoming. It's, I don't know. That's just resonating with me right now.
I was thinking along those lines too, Stacy. And one of the things that struck me when we were talking about this is that when your kid does something, I just became a great aunt. My nephew had a son. Friday. And, they're just starting the journey. And it's so funny to me that when your kid does something, it doesn't have to be much. I became my grandson's now 3 months old. I only know him on FaceTime, but it's so funny to me that they were laughing hysterically the other day on this little tiny video they sent me because he loves this music box thing. He was so distracted, he couldn't suck his bottle. He couldn't. He was so joyful at this music and they were hysterical. They were laughing at it. And I was thinking about it in terms of joy. It always felt to me that we couldn't be mandated to feel joy. Or on the alternate, on Tisha B'Av, it's very hard to be mandated to feel sad. It seems like in our nature as human beings, we want to feel what we want to feel when we feel it. Let me just feel organically, however I feel that particular day.
Right.
But Judaism is so, when you're raising a kid, you're so locked into what they're doing. They create in you that joy because of your connection to them all the way through. And I wasn't having a particularly outstanding day, but I saw somebody else's joy that this baby finally got here, and you're connected to it. It makes you feel a certain way. And I think Judaism tries to get us to connect to our heritage so strongly that even if you're not organically maybe predisposed to feel a certain way on Purim, you're mandated to hook into that joy. And
we're supposed to look for it and find it and do the work, because it goes back to what we said at the very beginning of, this is something that we do, that we're actively a part of. We have to make it for ourselves. It's not something that God makes for us. And that's, emphasizing that, as much as God creates the structure in our lives and so much that we have and all the mitzvot and all of our, the fact that we can breathe, that's something that comes from God, but we have to do something with it. So you're absolutely right that, we have to seize that joy. I'm going to just read this last text for us and we'll wrap up. So just give me a couple more minutes because I want to be mindful of our time. But there's Rabbi Chavish Danesh is a rabbi in Israel who teaches at Or Sameach and at others yeshivot there. But I thought what he said here was such a powerful way to think about the joy right now and always, but it very much so connects, I think, to what Deb was saying. So he points out that the word Megillah shares the same root as Megaleh, which means to reveal. Furthermore, the name Esther shares the same root as we all know, Nistar, which means hidden. Hence, Megillat Esther literally means revealing that which is hidden, which I thought was fantastic. Revealing the hidden hand of God is exactly what the Megillah is meant to do. This is precisely why the Megillah never explicitly mentions the name of God. God's name was purposely left out of the Megillah to teach us to search for the guiding hand of God, even when it is not revealed, and thereby come to realize that God is not only the driving force behind open miracles, but also nature as well. With this in mind, we can gain an insight into the custom of wearing costumes on Purim. A mask, and for us, masks now mean a million things. There's so much emotional baggage with a mask. So you'll feel it as I read this, because I did. A mask covers the identity and, to a certain degree, the existence of the one wearing it. It is only when we lift the mask that we can see who's behind it. In Hebrew, the word olam, world, shares a root with the word ne'elam, hidden. This is because the consistent laws of nature hide the presence of God, as a mask hides the identity of the one behind it. It's left up to us to see through the mask and reveal God's presence in the world. Purim, by the nature of its hidden miracles, is the perfect time to remind ourselves that there is more to the world than what meets the eye. Hence the custom to wear costumes on this day. And I thought, he said it so beautifully. But thinking about, what sort of what can we do this Purim to experience the revealing of hidden miracles? And I hadn't heard it before. I thought it was such a beautiful thing to translate Megillat Esther there as the revealing of the hidden. Yeah, it was just such a, like, yes, that's what we're doing. And turning things upside down makes things funny and makes us sort of, one feeling leads to another of laughter and joy and internalizing that. There's also a really deep joy that comes from creating it ourselves and saying, I'm going to be happy. I'm going to find that happiness. I'm going to seek it out. And that's the prescription, like what Vicky was referencing. It's a prescription because, you have to take the medicine. You have to do something. You have to be a part of that healing process. And that's an amazing gift that God gave us. So I want to end just by asking us, and this can be, a takeaway question to think about as we go, what the role of simcha is in your personal spiritual journey. So there's, you may have read this book, Happier, by Tal Ben Shachar. It was recommended to me recently, and it talks about happiness that we can have. And one of the sections, one of his like meditations, is on time affluence versus time poverty. And that, time affluence is feeling that you can do, you have sufficient time to pursue activities that are personally meaningful, to reflect, to engage in leisure. And time poverty is the feeling when you're constantly stressed, rushed, overworked, and behind. And we're, I think, so much so during these times, vacillating between time affluence and time poverty is something that is very connected to how we all feel joy right now. So I want to give us that intention to think, in our own spirituality and our faith and how we daven and care for that part of who we are, how we can feel like we're affluent in that, where it really does cultivate lasting joy. And I hope that Purim can be a time where we can seize the joy, make it real, make it happen for each other, obviously within the context that we're in, and that it can be, Bezrat Hashem, a joy that will be deeper, that can take us for years to come, with meaning, with connection. And I will end. Hold on, someone just said something in the chat. I will end, that's a great plug. Cindy is in charge of our Shavuot project. And the Shavuot project is a chance for us to think about Shavuot when we're thinking about Purim, but also to write and share Torah in really deep ways. And so, part of thinking back to the rabbis referencing Torah as a form of joy. If you're interested in writing for that this year, it's like, it doesn't have to be super scholarly. It can be a Devar Torah. It can be a source sheet that you make, but just sharing your Torah in a meaningful way, especially as women in the community, is really, really needed. And I think also a way to bring joy to each other in these times. So please contact me or Cindy if you're interested in that. And the last thing that I was going to end on is that there's a chance on Wednesday to do, to support Sharsheret and have some joy in taking moments of struggle and illness and turning it into a chance for healing and connection and awareness. And that is something that we would, several people on here are involved in. Rena and Julie, Susie, there are like many people involved here. So I hope that I'll see you for exercise and sort of physical enjoyment and awareness on Wednesday as well. So check that out.
I just want to say one thing, one very quick thing. When we look back now at last Purim, and we now know that really there were already people coming down with COVID at the end of January and throughout February. When I think about really what an open miracle it was, what a nace it was. We shut down just days after Purim. That Purim was screaming Haman, and all the Seudah and all of the Shalach Manas is kind of a super spreader event. That nobody in our community contracted anything during that time was kind of a miracle.
It's seeing our health and our sort of, it's so much is out of control, but being able to look back and have gratitude on moments like that are very, very important and healing. And, we don't know why things have happened as they have, but I think that any chance we can have to support each other and to feel gratitude also cultivates joy. So thank you for ending with that feeling, Deb. And I missed celebrating. Go ahead.
Just one more shameless plug, which is, speaking of the joy of Purim, there is a phenomenal Purim spiel that will be coming your way on Purim night, 9 p.m. It's for grown-ups, not for kids, and it'll be a lot of fun. So I hope you guys all be there.
100%. Anything we can do to bring joy to each other right now, we need it. And especially, we think it's the year anniversary. We
Yeah.
We were together then, and may we be together again. Yasher Koach, guys. Thank you so much.
Thank
So,
you.
thank you again to Julie and Stacy for
Thank you.
organizing.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for letting me join in.
Thank you for being here, Tamar.